Pull gauge set to 0. Ready to go. About 4.94. Reset it. .92. .95. So about 4 pounds 9 ounces. All right, Gen 5 G17. This is with the Timney trigger. Yes, I'll go over the how it works on a Gen 5 here in just a minute. All right, trigger gauge is on 0. Ready to go. About 2 pounds 1.3 ounces. Reset on 0. And 3 pounds 3 ounces on that one. Pulled a little slower. Reset back to 0. 2 pounds 7 ounces. 2 pounds 8 ounces. 2 pounds 12 ounces. I'm getting a little difference in my pull, but high 2 to low 3 pounds. Okay, taking a look at the Timney trigger that just came out, the Glock Alpha Competition Series. I have it in this Gen 5 G17. Give you a little preview on how the trigger pull looks. Okay, so you can see the safety tab is engaged on the frame there. All right, got quite a bit of take up. Travel and brake. Reset is a little sluggish on this one. Okay, anyways, yes, you can make it work on a Gen 5. I'm using a Gen 3 trigger housing that I swapped out for this one. This is the factory Gen 5 trigger housing. I'm using the Timney trigger bar, so this is the factory trigger bar that I replaced. And then because the trigger body itself on the Timney housing is not cut for the Gen 5 slide lock, so you can see how it straddles both sides there, right? The Timney is not cut right here, okay? So I'm making this work because I have a single-sided Gen 3, Gen 4 slide lock in it, all right? So that's how I've got it to work on a Gen 5, okay? So let's take a quick peek and check on how our safeties are functioning. Okay, so we got the Cruciform drop safety, acts the same way, and that basically is keeping the gun safe by keeping it up on this ledge right here. Okay, so you can see safety tab engaged on the frame. It sits on the ledge. I cannot depress it. The sear is not able to drop at all. So that's operating like it should. Safety tab is operating like it should. Last thing to check is the plunger safety. Okay. Here we are. Safety tab is engaged in the frame. We can see the plunger, safety plunger here on the side, and I am not able to depress the firing pin at all. Okay, so when I depress the trigger all the way, I'm now able, see all that travel? I'm now able to depress the firing pin. Let the trigger forward, and it's now blocked. Okay, so all the safeties work on this the way they're supposed to. My initial impressions on the trigger, without any additional modifications done, It's smooth. There's not really a lot of hiccups in it. You don't feel much for, guys will describe it as grit, or, the trigger feels rough. And typically what that is when they're describing that is typically that roughness that they're feeling is this relationship here as the trigger bar slides off of the firing pin lug. Usually you can feel a little something, in there if it's not real smooth. And you can fix that by polishing these surfaces. Sometimes that roughness comes back because you've got plating on the trigger bar and a plating on the firing pin. And if you go polishing on that stuff too much, you can burn through that plating. And sometimes it just gets rough again. So the way the sear operates in this, it definitely, since you have the trigger bar running over the top of the sear here, it's just a smoother engagement, smoother surface to work with. The whole trigger is just a lot smoother. So that take up there and then it gets hard. The reason it's getting hard right there is because we're up on the connector, all right? And so this is with a factory connector in the gun, factory firing pin spring and all that, and it still dropped the trigger weight down significantly. So that's impressive. Real clean break. Like I said, this one's got a little sluggish reset, but I think that's just the way I got the gun set up right now. I could probably go back through, throw some lube on it, and clean a few surfaces up, and that'd probably come right back to being a real snappy reset. So yeah, it's got just a little bit of drag in there, and I'm also got this thing rigged up. It's a Gen 5 with a with some Gen 3 parts in it, So, but like I said, initial impression is it's good, but it's nothing fantastic. That's because, like I said, it's got still all this pre-travel in it. Now it does have an adjustment screw. You can't see it here because it's covered up by the frame. It has an adjustment screw to take out pre-travel, but you're not going to be able to take much out compared to what's already here, because then your trigger safety tab is not going to operate correctly. And then also you're going to start pulling that back off of the drop safety is also going to be disengaged pretty quickly. I can see about right there it's off. Right there it's off of the shelf, so I've still got all that, right? So good trigger, not great. But we're going to cut to part 2 here in a minute, and I'm going to talk about how fantastic this trigger can be with some additional modifications done that really bring this thing to life. So we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. All right, going to talk about the Timney real quick now that it's been modified. Got a clear gun. Clear trigger gauge. All right. About 2 pounds, 6 ounces, 2.67. Clear that. £2, 11 ounces. 2 pounds, 14 ounces. A little variation in there. 2 pounds, 7 ounces. Consistently under 3 pounds. So let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so we got safety tab. I've got enough pre-travel in here that I still have a little bit of a wall. Break. Reset, and it kind of resets basically all the way out. The way it's set with the pre-travel stock factory Glock dot connector, it basically behaves like a real nice 2-stage. So short break. If I let out, yeah. So when I let out, it wants to jump all the way back. And if you're the way you're prepping the trigger, you're basically going to come back off to this point. So okay, so overall impression on the new Timney Alpha trigger. In stock form, it is nothing real fantastic. The way the safety tab on the trigger works, you cannot really take much pre-travel out of it, so you're going to have a real long, uptake, basically a real long first stage, if you will. You know, it's going to start way out here. You're going to pull back on it. It's going to hit the wall eventually, and then it breaks. So yes, it's lighter. And it accomplishes that by basically the way that receiver works, the trigger bar pushing down on the sear essentially, and it's pre-cocked the firing pin all the way back, so you're not having to defeat that firing pin spring. So the benefit of that is that you're able to get a 3-pound or sub 3-pound trigger pull with a firing pin spring that is close to OEM, or OEM a 6-pound firing pin spring. I have a 5-pound spring in this gun right now. And so that begs the question of, well, why would we need to screw around with lighter firing pin springs in that case? Why wouldn't everybody just run a 6-pound spring, because then you get guaranteed primary ignition? You're still in a competition pistol or a custom pistol, you're still going to need to mess with firing pin spring weights and drop spring weights if you start dropping recoil spring weight significantly. So like if I'm trying to get away with a 10-pound recoil spring, which is extremely light in a Glock, it's about the low limit of how light you can go. I cannot use a 10-pound recoil spring with a 6-pound stock firing pin spring, because the firing pin spring will basically be pulling the slide out of battery. So it does not completely eliminate the need to lighten your firing pin spring weight. It does allow you to use the highest spring weight that you can, though, without having to worry about primary ignition. Engagement, even with the trigger pre-travel pulled all the way out, is still real solid. It's at least 60%, 70%, somewhere in that ballpark. I flung this thing against the bench a bunch of times, and the trigger never broke when I didn't want it to. So the safeties were still all working correctly. To pull the pre-travel out to the point that you have that right there, you will need to do some additional modifications to the trigger. The safety tab has to be trimmed. Now, with that said, I'm not a huge fan of the safety tab design. Once you start trimming on that safety tab, I feel like it's getting a little anemic there in the middle, to the point that if I was running a steady diet of plus P ammo, or if I was trying to build a 9 major gun, I'd be worried that the excess pressure was going to shear the safety tab off. I've ran into that problem extensively with the Apex triggers. I was shearing the little wall inside of the trigger body. I think I broke 5 of them before I finally gave up on them. And the problem when that happens is if you on the Apex, you shear that wall off, the spring for the safety tab isn't captured anymore. It flies out, and so then you have a non-functional safety tab. On this, I'm worried that the little piece that contacts the frame, I'm worried because of the way you have to trim it to pull the pre-travel out. I'm worried that piece is too thin, and over time you're going to shear the back of the safety tab off, and you're going to wind up with a non-functional safety tab. So what I may end up doing is running the Timney receiver and bar with a third-party trigger bar, or my own trigger bar eventually, or excuse me, not trigger bar, but trigger shoe. I may end up eventually just making my own. So the safety tab is a little bit of a liability if you're trying to pull all the pre-travel out, and if you have to trim it. Going over to the drop safety, Cruciform, whatever you want to call it, I would not feel comfortable without doing some additional modification to the trigger housing that I've done on this gun to basically extend the ledge that the trigger bar sits on to keep the drop safety from operating correctly. Other than that, the plunger safety, the vertical extension can be trimmed in the same way. Everything else is good to go on it. So I will say cheers to Timney for thinking outside the box. The way they went about it was real impressive. In factory form, buy the Timney Alpha, throw it in your Glock, don't do any other mods. It's not that impressive, other than the fact that it gives you the ability to keep a factory firing pin spring. That benefit right there, and it cleaning the trigger up a little bit. It's all right. I'd spend the money on it. It'd be nothing, to write home about. That's super awesome. With additional modifications done correctly to the point that it gives me a super short reset, crisp break. Super short break and crisp reset. I'm very pleased with it, and I think it's probably going to be what I put in most of the guns that I build moving here forward. So with the additional mods, that's where it really comes alive. I compared it to a Fox Body Mustang to somebody. An old Fox Body is not real impressive, but they take to modifications super well. That's basically what this trigger is. Now, one thing that needs to be addressed, you are not going to get this trigger down to 4 ounces or 3 ounces. The correct way to pull a trigger gauge is with a slow, smooth pull, the way that I did it in the video. The safety tab is about 11 ounces or so. You're not going to get a lighter. You're not going to have something that breaks it at 4 ounces that's past something that breaks at 11 ounces. If the safety tab was 11 ounces and the trigger was truly 4 ounces, when you pulled the safety tab, that 11 ounces of pressure would immediately break the trigger. You saw in the video, realistically, this is about a 2.5 to 3 pound trigger. With an electronic gauge, you can trick it by snapping on it real hard. And I put a photo up, of a 5 ounce reed on this trigger where I snapped the gauge. So to correctly measure this, you need to get a smooth, slow pull on it. Obviously, being that it's operating on a fulcrum, if you pull at the very edge of the trigger, you get a lighter reed. Now, I do shoot with my finger a little bit lower towards the bottom because it gives me clean disengagement of the safety tab. If I pull up at the top, not on this trigger, it's still, I'm able to defeat the safety tab easily. On some other trigger designs, though, with the way the tab is shaped, if you pull real high at the top, sometimes you'll get the tab catching on the frame, and it'll kind of give you a hiccup in your pull. So for that reason, I just kind of, retaught myself where I place my finger on the trigger. So I think that pretty much addresses everything. If anybody's got any questions about it, hit me up in the DMs or whatever, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you got. You guys have a good one.